this video, I'm going to teach you how to make a battle-ready Dark Angel Space Marine in less than 20 minutes using a mixture of contrast paints and regular acrylic paints. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to lay down a prime undercoat on the miniature. And I really like using my black primer. You'll see almost anything I paint, I use a simple black primer. Now, you can use Chaos Black from Games Workshop. However, I find that the black ultra flat Krylon paint works really well. It does go on a little bit wet, compared to Chaos Black from Games Workshop, and that means you really do have to let it dry. It will almost look like you've overpainted it, but as it dries, a lot of the liquid evaporates, and it actually leaves a really thin coat that looks really great. Once you've done the basic black prime, then after that, you do need to start thinking about what we call the zenithal highlight. And what this does is it allows us to have the black shadows underneath to stay on the model, while the grey sear paint is creating a highlight above it. And this is actually duplicating sunlight. You know, typically sunlight is above our heads, so it's lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. And this is going to be really important to give us a nice pre-shade, so that when we add the contrast paints, it's going to really add some depth to that model and look a lot more interesting, rather than if we just painted the entire thing in the grey sear primer. So as you can see here, we've got our miniature that's been primed, and you can see the dark shading sort of like underneath in the lower part of the legs and under the gun and the shoulder pads, and yet the rest of the model's still quite bright on top. This is going to allow us to have that really nice shading that we're looking for when we add the contrast paint. And I'm going to be using the Dark Angel contrast paint to apply the color to the model. Now, I'm actually going to use this straight from the pot, because contrast paints really have been designed to be used in that way. You really can put them on with one thick coat, and the people that I've seen using it wrong, the thing they get wrong is they apply a thin coat, but you actually want to use thickness. It's similar to the Krylon primer in that it will look really wet and thick, but it actually dries really nicely as gravity pulls the pigment down into the recesses, and it gives you a natural highlight and shadow effect. I've seen a lot of different people try and use these paints online. They've only been out for about a week so far, and in my opinion, a lot of people aren't using them to their full effectiveness. There are people that are watering them down with medium, which you absolutely can do, but it kind of defeats the point of a contrast paint. You know, if you water it down, then you've got to do multiple layers and it's going to take longer. I found just doing one big thick coat really does work exactly as Games Workshop said it would, but most people are over brushing it, in my opinion. You can see here when I put it on the backpack, rather than continuing to brush, I'm going to add more paint, and I'll continually apply more paint to the model to make it so that I'm not overspreading it. I found that the overspreading, what happens is the bristles on your brush actually dry up the paint and leave streaks. Whereas if you continue just applying new paint each time, then it's going to look better. The key with this really is to apply it to the entire model. That means even the black areas underneath where you were spraying before, where it's like darker and the gray sear didn't get there, because the different undertones from your primer will create different shades in the contrast paint, and that is what makes it look really good. You'll also notice that on the shoulder pads, I brush in the same direction each time, so there's no conflicting brush strokes. Just in case it does leave any streaks, it will look like part of the design. So I find that brushing downwards on that makes it look better. By and large, I try to avoid the gun as well, because I know that I'm going to be painting the gun a different color, and contrast paints don't like going over themselves. They need you to apply a primer again. Obviously, I'm going to go over the gun a little bit, but I don't worry about it too much. I'll fix that with some primer later on. And I can't lie, there are sometimes I just completely forget not to paint the gun, and I end up putting the contrast paint on it. But ultimately, you can fix it with the primer, so it's not a big deal. And as you can see, there's no technique really needed in this. You're just making sure that you're applying the paint thick and over the entire model. And you can see it's even starting to dry a little bit on the helmet there already. And that's, even though it's dry on the higher areas, that's because the pigment has started to pool into the shadows. But still, the shadows are going to be very wet, and they're going to stay wet for a while. So one of the things that takes the longest about painting these models is the dry time. So they work much better if you're batch painting them. But still, I find on average, I can get a battle-ready miniature done in under 20 minutes, which is pretty impressive considering the quality of how these things tend to come out. And so as you can see, in no time at all, the miniature is completely done, and then you'll just leave that there to dry. Once you've got your fully dry contrast painted Dark Angel, it's time to go back and start thinking about where we're going to have color. Now, the first thing we need to do is to touch up all the areas where we got contrast paint on the gun, because of course we don't want the gun to have any of that Dark Angel color showing through, as we're going to paint it a completely different color. And this is where, again, I'm just using the Gray Sear primer from the brush now and going through and just touching up all the areas where I got contrast paint where I don't want it to be. So that, of course, is going to be all over the gun here. And it's pretty simple to just go through and touch it up. You'll see that I'm not really using a very small brush for this, and that's because I actually find a thicker brush works quite well in supporting the tip. I really like the thicker brushes that Games Workshop sells that are sort of like short and stubby. I find that the brush is a little bit easier to control. I'm using the paint straight from the pot, but pulling it from the lid of the paint pot, so it's a little bit easier to grab. And sometimes I'll use the wet palette if I feel that what I've grabbed is a little bit too dry. As you can see, they're just placing it there. And I'm also going to go around and I'm going to touch all the pouches around the Dark Angel's belt, because that way I can add some color later on via contrast paints. I use a mixture of contrast paints and regular acrylic paints depending on what I'm painting, and it's all about how many layers I'm going to put on. If I need to paint something in more than 2 layers, then I'm probably going to use the regular acrylic style, because you get a little bit more control and it tends to look a bit better. But if the contrast paint is going to allow me to do it in just 2 quick layers, then I'm usually going to just use the primer and then a contrast paint to get the effect that I want. One of the paints that I think looks really good is Snakebite Leather. I think it makes the leather look great. And so I'm going to make sure that I use the Gray Sear primer here so that I can go around all these pouches and add Snakebite Leather. So after I've got that primer down, I've got to wait for it to dry before I add a contrast paint. So I'm going to start using this Retributor Gold to pick out the emblem. I really like the way that Retributor Gold works as a base coat. I find that the real metallics look really good against the contrast paints. Of course, Games Workshop doesn't make any contrast paint metallics. They wouldn't work in the same way. So this is really just about fine brush strokes, just being a bit careful, trying to make sure that I don't go back over that gun or on any of the green. And you see here again, I'm using that thick Games Workshop brush. It's one of my favorites. It just gives you a lot of control. The tip of the brush goes exactly where you want it to. People think they need to use very small brushes all the time. I find for faster painting, you actually don't need to use a small brush. You can really use a thicker brush because it's all about point control. You want to make sure that point goes where you want. And a thinner brush, sometimes the point will move in areas where you don't want. And you can see here I got a little bit of gold on the shoulder pad just there, and I try to brush it off with my finger. Sometimes that's a trick that works, sometimes it doesn't. So what I'll do is I'll instantly try and brush it off if I can, and if I don't get away with it, then I just know it's something I need to touch up a little bit later on. Or of course, if I'm going to paint the edge of the shoulder pad a different color, then it doesn't really matter. So again, I'm just thinking, what are the areas where I want gold? So obviously I want this piece of this emblem on the bolt gun to be gold, so I'm just adding that there, and this is just a simple base coat of this Retributor Gold, letting me know where I want the gold to be. So next I'm getting this Mephiston Red, which I'm using as a base color, and I'm going to go around and do the edges of the shoulder pads. Now, the reason that I'm using this rather than a contrast paint is because I really want to have some control over where it goes and get like a fine line. If I were to use a contrast paint, I'd have to use the Gray Sear first and then the contrast paint, and I'd run the risk of the contrast bleeding into the green, and then it might give me an untidy edge. I've seen a lot of different people do this, and in fact, Games Workshop's tutorials show to do this area with the contrast paint, and I think it just makes much more sense to use a regular acrylic. They're a little bit more dry, and you've got a little bit more control over them. So I find that's a better way to go, and it really is not difficult to go through and fix it with the red. You can see here that I've put a little bit of red base on the green backpack, and again I'm using a clean brush now to clean that off. One of the cool things about acrylics that I don't think people realize is if you move fast enough and you add a little bit of water on your brush, you can sometimes erase mistakes, which is exactly what I did there, so I can keep going without having to repaint that entire area. And again, I'm just going to go around all the edges of this here on both sides to get it looking good. Now that the Gray Sear has dried up on the bolt gun, I'm going to take the Contrast Blood Angels Red and I'm going to apply it all over the areas of the bolt gun that I want to be red. I've been playing Warhammer for almost 30 years now, and so I remember Games Workshop's red phase where all bolt guns were red, and I kind of can't get it out of my head. In my head, bolt guns have to be red. And so what I'm doing is going through all the key panels here and just adding that Contrast Blood Angels Red to the area. And this is great because it's going to give me a highlight, a shadow, and of course the core color all in a single coat. So all I had to do was touch up the primer, and then it's really easy to just add this on. I'm being careful to avoid all the areas that I want to be metal, because I'm actually going to use a contrast paint for the metal areas, so I have to be a little bit careful here, but it doesn't take too long to cover the entire gun in that color. And so now I've done the red and let it dry just for a little bit, I can grab this basilicanum gray, and I'm going to add all the metal colors in this gray. So I'm going through the barrel and the back of the gun and the magazine, and of course the sight here. And I'm just adding this basilicanum gray, and I find this makes a really nice metal color if you edge highlight with a metallic color afterwards. I'm about to show you what that looks like in a moment once this dries, but I find that it adds some great contrast. It's almost like a non-metallic metal effect, except with a metal highlight, so it really does stand out. And you get this really nice contrast between the non-metallic shadows and the metallic highlights, which really just goes to sell the effect and make it look metal. So now I'm using an Evil Sun's layer paint on the shoulder pads to add a little bit more color to the highlighted areas. Now, what's cool about this is like the old style of layer painting. I'm not trying to paint over everything I painted with the Mephiston red as the base coat. I'm just thinking, where would the light be hitting it, and just adding this color to those areas. This is just going to make it brighten up in the areas that would be brighter due to sunlight hitting them or what have you, and it just makes it stand out a little bit more and looking good. And now I'm going to add the Reikland Flesh shade to the Retributor Gold from earlier, just to add some shadows and some definition in there. You can see that if I go over the green, it's not a problem because it's a wash. I can literally just pull it off with my finger or another brush if I wanted to. So I don't have to be as careful there. And then I'm adding it to the emblem at the front as well there. Once again, this is just going to add some shadows into that gold and make it look a little bit more rich. Next, I'm adding snakebite leather to all of the pouches. What I love about snakebite leather is it really does create an organic color. It pools in such a beautiful way that makes it look organic. You really don't have to be too careful with this color. Remember that you're not trying to have a perfect image, you're just trying to make it look like leather, and so it's absolutely fine for it to be discolored in areas. And so it's such a great paint to use. It's probably one of my favorite contrast paints. And with just one coat, the brown looks really, really nice. Next, I'm taking the Black Templar contrast paint, and I'm just finishing up the pistol. So I'm doing the handle and the barrel at the bottom of the gun. You'll notice that I just put the black straight over the contrast brown snakebite leather, and that works absolutely well because the black's such a strong dark color that it can go over the other colors, and it just darkens them up a bit. I even added it to the ammo magazine there just to add a little bit of depth and darkness. Sometimes I'll do that. I'm just holding the paint in my hand and I just decide to randomly add a detail because I want to. So now I'm going to do the eyes of the model, and I'm actually going to use the grey cere again. I'm using a very small brush now, and I'm just going to create almost like tiny little lines or ovals inside the Dark Angel's eyes here. I'm trying to be careful not to go over the lines. And I find that the grey cere works absolutely great for the eye technique that I use. You could use white here if you didn't want to, but I've already got grey cere on the palette, so why not use it? So now I'm going to use a Liberator Gold to start picking out the highlights on the gold areas that I painted earlier. The Reikland wash has dried into the shadows, and so I'm trying very hard not to just paint over the whole thing. I just want to pick out the edges and the raised areas, areas where light would naturally catch and make it look really bright. And you'll see that I'll move the model around to give me the easiest access. And, I'm just trying to pick out the tips of the wings and the highlights. Really, I don't have to cover the entire area because shadow would make some of that gold darker. So, a lot of people get obsessed about trying to get into the edges and the shadows, but when you're just trying to make something battle ready and have it looking, pretty badass, then you just have to go for the bits that are easy to reach and just trust that the darker colors will just fade into the distance, and, that makes the whole thing just look better anyway. So now that grey cere is probably dried because it was a very small amount of paint, I'm going to use one of my favorite eye techniques, which is actually just to grab a shade. In this case, I'm using Cassandra Yellow, and I'm just going to drip a drop in there into each eye. And you can see it's almost like too much there, but that's not a problem because I can take off the excess with another brush until I reduce it down again. And the Cassandra Yellow is going to struggle to take over the green anyway, and I can brush it off before it dries. And, in this case, I'm reapplying it. I just want to add a little bit more until I get the color that I like. What's cool about this is the natural properties of that shade will just stain the grey cere. and it'll give me a really nice, almost, glow effect. But it's very easy to do, and you don't have to be as accurate or as delicate. And then you get sort of like darker in the edges and lighter in the center, but without any real technique or need to blend in any way. Now, this is one of my favorite things to do with these battle-ready Marines, and that's to look at where the contrast paint has created natural highlights and then pick them up even more using the highlight or edge highlight you would typically use for this model. So I'm using Niblet Green in this case, and I think this is really what helps my miniatures pop. I'm not doing every single edge, I'm just picking out some of the edges. So it's almost like I'm adding a highlight to the natural highlight in the contrast miniature. This really only takes a moment, but it looks incredibly polished and it adds this depth to the model that you typically only see in sort of like most people's pro painted. But it's cool because I'm getting the guidance on exactly where to add the Niblet Green highlight based on the contrast paint. And actually, I'm looking for the areas where the contrast paint highlight is most prominent and then adding the green there. And again, not over all of it, just the places that are easy to reach, enough that it will make it stand out if one were to see it, but not enough that I would end up overdoing anything. So I don't have to spend too much time on this, and I'm really just thinking, what are the easiest areas? And I like Niblet Green because it's a dry paint, so you've got very minimal chance of it spilling out anywhere and ruining the rest of the model, but it still gives it that really nice crisp color and almost gives it a studio feel. And then finally, I'm just picking out some of these other details that I missed, like the purity seal on the leg. Again, this can be done with a contrast paint really easily, so I'm adding some gray cere on it first of all to function as the base for the parchment. And then I'm going to take some Mephiston red to be the core part of the purity seal. I could, add a wash over that if I wanted to add some depth to it, but I don't always bother. Sometimes, it's such a small detail, most people don't notice. You could even use a contrast red over it if you wanted to. Now I'm gonna, while the grey cere is drying on the purity seal, I'm gonna get some of this Necron compound, and you can see that sometimes you have to reactivate it. Necron compound gets a bit weird, the dry paint, so I'll mix some water into it and mash it into my wet palette until it gets to the consistency that I like. And then I'm going to use that metallic paint as a highlight. And essentially I'm just going to run lines straight down the sort of like the barrel areas and then pick out the edges. And what's cool about this is it adds a really nice metallic sheen against that basilicanum gray, but it makes the whole thing stand out and look really nice. And, you're just trying to pick out the raised areas here to make the whole thing just look like it's metal. And it really does make it shine and get a really nice effect. Like I said, it's like a cross between non-metallic metal and metallic metal. It ends up looking really good. And then I'm going to go back to that purity seal there, and this is a skeleton horde, which I find makes a really nice parchment over the grey cere. And it's cool, you just put it on in one coat and it looks like a piece of old parchment. Very easy to do. The benefit of these contrast paints. And there you have it, the finished battle-ready Dark Angel Space Marine. And using this same technique, I was able to paint Space Wolves, Dark Angels, and a whole bunch of other Space Marines in less than 20 minutes per model. And in fact, the more you do it, the faster you get. So feel free to go out there, give it a try. I absolutely love this style. I think it looks great, and I'm probably going to be painting a lot of my miniatures in this way in the future. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. If you've enjoyed watching it, please let me know what you think. Give me some comments, critiques, and feedback in the comments below. Let me know if you have any further questions, and thanks ever so much for watching.